Okay, so today we'll be talking about the chapter on ecology. So in this particular chapter, right, these are some of the things we'll be talking about. So what's the definition of ecology? When we talk about abiotic environment, we are talking about what are the factors, physical factors that would actually influence the environment. Biotic means the more the living things kind of factors. And then we have talk about the energy and nutrition follow, how is it like, in the form of food chain, food web. Then we have ecological pyramids, which will represent how we actually represent the whole the living things in the ecosystem, and then nutrient cycling, and finally the carbon sink. Okay, so over here we will need to know a few definition. So when we talk about habitat, right, the definition of habitat is basically the place or the environment where the organism lives. There are some examples for habitat. For example, you have the freshwater streams, which are mainly your lakes and rivers. Okay, then you have the forest. The forest is mainly filled with trees, greenery, grassland. It's a bit different from forest in the sense that the grasslands are mainly just made of grass patches without any high rising trees and whatnot. Okay, and then we have the mangrove, which is somewhat some submerged kind of aquatic environment. Okay, so habitats are generally where they live lah. Okay, then next we look at the population, the population, community, and ecosystem. So over here, we will take a look at how the breaks up are like. So population is basically how a group of organisms of the same species will be living in a particular habitat. Later, I'll be drawing one example for you to see. So they must actually belong to the same kind. So let's say humans are of the same species. So this would mean that all the humans staying in the same environment is a population of human beings. Then community is where you have other species interacting. Like for example, some of you have pets in your home. A dog or a cat or fishes may be of different kinds of species type as compared to you. So we call it a community. A community of where there are different populations of organisms living together and interacting with each other. Okay, and then of course, ecosystem is where you have the community interacting with the physical environment. Let's say the sunlight, no rain, wind, and maybe all these kind of factors. That's where it calls the ecosystem. And therefore, ecology is where is the general study of all these interactions with organisms with one another, as well as with the environment. Okay, so if let's say I were to draw let's say we uh, have a new page. Things, Bluetooth, Apple Pencil is not connected. Yeah, okay. So in this case, so what we can see is the habitat is like a house. Okay, so this is the habitat. And within the habitat, let's say you have a family of humans all staying inside, okay, etc. So this is so for the blue one, it's known as a population of humans. So this is one particular population. Then over here, maybe you have, you keep a fish tank, and within the fish tank, it has fishes. So you have a population of fishes. Then let's say you also have some insects crawling, like a spider crawling around. So you have a population of spiders. Okay, so all these are individually population because they all revolve around the same kind of what do you call that, species. Then together, all of these together will form a community. Okay, so that's where you can have a group of population coming together and how they interact with each other. That's what we call a community lah, in this case. So then what about the ecosystem? Ecosystem is, let's say this is your Chan family. Then in the HDB, you have another house that is maybe the Tan family. And then you have another one of the another building, maybe with the Lim family, etc. lah. These are some examples. So individually, together as a whole, they all come together as the ecosystem. And not only that, you see, they are also within your environment, you have like maybe the sun, the abiotic factors. You have the sun, you have the oxygen levels, um, and other abiotic factors. So together, all this comes in together to be your ecosystem. So that's the general differentiation. So if we look over here, we could see that the plants itself is one population. The snail that is located on the plants is another population. Then of course you have the tadpole, which is another population, and of course you have the sea water bugs, beetle lah. That's another population. All of these combined together is one ecosystem where the pond is the habitat, the place where they stay. Okay, and together they form the ecosystem. So for the environment, there are two types of factors that constitute the environment. So we have the abiotic environment that will consist of physical factors such as your light intensity, the water availability, and of course your soil and pH levels. Then you have the biotic environment, which consists of all living things with an organism interacting with each other. Okay, so when we talk about this, we have symbiosis, predator-prey relationship kind of examples. So for abiotic factors, what are these factors? So in a nutshell, these are the ones where you have the availability of water, because without water, right, it's very hard to we in our earlier chapter we also study the importance of water, and at the same time, water is quite key in terms of um, for maybe some of our growth or even digestion and things like this. Then light intensity is also important in a form like, let's say for photosynthesis, with high light intensity, then you also the plants are able to convert the light energy into chemical energy, that kind of thing. Then you have the temperature, which are mainly for enzymatic reactions, oxygen content for your aerobic respiration, pH of soil and water. These will influence the livelihood of some aquatic animals or even your plants. Salinity is of soil or in water means the amount of salt content in the water or soil. So for example, when we talk about freshwater environments, like for fishes, right? So they tend not to, you cannot take like the sea, ocean water and then you replace it because the salinity is different. And yeah. So for light intensity would actually influence the distribution and growth of plants and animals, in which the green plants would actually exist only when there is actually adequate amount of sunlight or light energy. And this is because they needed that light energy for photosynthesis. So the growth of certain plants will influence the distribution of animals as well in a location. Because these animals might be herbivores, which they feed on all these plant metals for food. Water, on the other hand, also do affect, in which right the factors that can influence water availability is mainly the air humidity as well as the pattern and amount of rainfall. So in this case, organisms we couldn't actually live without water we are as we are usually found in environments where water is usually in abundance. However, for areas that are where water is scarce, these organisms, right, they tend to be adapted for survival. For example, in a desert, you usually find cactus, and cactus has adapted needle-like leaves to help to minimize the surface area for exposure to the light, the sun, heat, and what's not to prevent transpiration that much. Okay. Then of course temperature. Temperature will affect the rate of reaction of enzymes that will control the physiological and metabolic activities of organism. So for example, snakes will hibernate in winter, and of course trees will also lose their leaves before winter. So these are some examples. Oxygen, so oxygen is generally needed for respiration to occur, and mangrove plants would have their roots buried in oxygen poor mud. So what happens for these mangrove plants, right, is that they will have roots that are pseudotrophos, which helps to ensure that these roots will actually get sufficient oxygen. So what we can see is that there are pores available at the upper version of the roots to actually absorb oxygen. And these are what we call the breathing roots that will project above the mud surface. Salinity, so how does salinity affects the organism? It generally refers to the salt concentration of water, and it affects the movement of salt and water in and out of the cell of the organisms living in water. So freshwater bony fishes tends to face problems of salt loss from the cell and excessive water entering the cell. So what happens is in the fish, right, the kidney will reabsorb these salts and produce large amount of dilute urine. So where are the salts uptake? They are generally uptakes by the cells in the gills. Okay. So for salinity, so like for example, your marine bony fish, right, will face problems of water loss from cells as excess salt actually enters into the cells. So this seawater is absorbed in the intestine, and then the kidney will excrete the salt and produce a small amount of concentrated urine. Finally, we talk about pH, where for pH it refers to the acidity and alkalinity of the solution. So most organisms can either survive within this range of optimum pH, and at the plants like a blueberry or your orchids will grow better in acidic soil. So for several microorganisms that can be found to thrive in highly acidic condition, such microorganisms are what we call acidophiles. Okay. In the biotic environment, the living or biotic environment will comprise of all the living organisms in which an organisms would be able to interact with. And therefore, organisms interacting with one another in various ways, we could actually see the video, but of course, we will not be watching it today. So generally, what we can see is some of these birds, right, they tend to occupy quite closely along the hippo, and what they does is it will actually help to clean the teeth of the hippo by eating up all those like meat lah and what's not, so as to clean it. Okay, and of course the hippo will act as some form of kind of protection or a mobile kind of habitat for it to actually move from one place to another. Then of course you have the interactions between carnivorous plants and insects. So this is something like predator prey, where some of these insects will actually fly close to the mouth of the Venus flytrap, and then from there get trapped. So you can see that it's actually a one-way kind of relationship lah. So for the populations in the organisms, they tend in a community, they tend to live interdependently from each other, and a change in one population would generally influence the other populations in a community. So how is it so? So let's say we can see that the snail is dependent on the plants for some food. So if one day the plants are no longer available, these snails will have no food to eat, and they will slowly die off. So that we can see it's like the snail's population is dependent on the population of the plants. Okay. So next we look at the energy and nutrients flow, where energy and nutrients are generally transferred in the following direction via feeding. So living organisms in an ecosystem can be categorized into the following group. We have the producers, the consumers, and also the decomposers. So when we talk about the producers, consumers, and decomposers, producers are generally organisms that are able to produce their own source of food, whereas for consumers, they are generally organisms that will actually feed on either each other if they are carnivores, or they'll feed on the plants which are known as herbivores. Okay, then of course you have the decomposers. The decomposers are the ones that would actually help to decompose the dead organisms so that they'll be able to, revert the whole cycle back. So in the sense, we can see that producers, they must have this particular function where they're able to convert the light energy from the sun into chemical energy in the form of food during photosynthesis. Not all plant, there are some other organisms like bacteria that can also do this. So they are your photosynthetic bacteria. So all food chain starts with the producer, and some examples are like your algae, your green plants. Consumers, on the other hand, has different stages or different parts. There are three main types: your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Where primary consumers are your herbivores, so they are the first layer of organism that would actually eat up the producers. So that's where they feed on plants only. So secondary consumers, they tend to feed on animals, and they tend to be herbivores, carnivores in this case. Tertiary consumers, they are also carnivores, and that they also feed on other carnivores. So you can see that we don't really have even more layers of these kind of consumers, because you will need a more bigger predator to actually hunt on all these kind of organisms. Okay. So for decomposers, you will obtain energy by breaking down the dead organism feces and excretory products. So the decomposition process will release inorganic nutrients, for example, your carbon and nitrogen for nutrient cycling. And the examples of these decomposers can include your fungi, your bacteria, and even your earthworms. For a food chain, a series of organisms through which energy is transferred in the form of food lah. So we have the producers that will lead to the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and finally your tertiary consumers. So this will illustrate the transfer of energy among organisms, and a food chain will always begin with a producer in this case. For trophic level, each level or organism in a food chain, right? You have the producers, which are grass, and then you have the primary consumer, which is your grasshopper, so they will feed on the grass. And of course, the toad will, which is a secondary consumer, usually a carnivore, they'll feed on the grasshopper, and the snake will feed on the toad. So generally, food chains, they do not have more than 4 trophic levels, because only 10% of the energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, and that organisms at the higher trophic levels will not be able to receive enough or sufficient energy. So for a food web, the food web will consist of interlinked food chain, where we could see that for the green plant, right, we could actually move in terms of you have different organisms, and in this case, right, what we can see is we have multiple layers of food chain. So for example, the one I highlight is one example. So this one food chain. Then let's say I were to highlight using orange, this is another layer of food chain. So that's 2. Then we also have 3. See, 3 is another one. Then we have another one, 4. Okay, we have this one, 5. Or another one, 6. So there is many different kinds of levels of food chain. Okay, and of course, the next thing is we talk about energy flow that is non-cyclic. Non-cyclic, right, as compared to cyclic, means that for non-cyclic, right, they do not return back to the source of where the energy resides on. So that's where that's the meaning of non-cyclic. It's not cycling. Whereas cyclic energy flow is where you would see that energy will eventually go back to to the main source. So in this case, if we look at non-cyclic, right, the sun is the main source of energy in the ecosystem. And how is it done in a sense is that the light energy is usually converted into chemical energy via the process photosynthesis. And how organisms are able to transfer this energy is in the form of feeding. That means they will consume each other through predator prey. Okay, and that we could see that the energy, right, the heat doesn't go back to the sun. So that's where we talk about it being non-cyclic, and that this energy is lost to the environment as heat is being transferred at every stage. So what we can see is that at every phase, right, there will always be a loss in energy. Okay, and it's not from the counted from the original energy source, but from the previous level that was being taken up. So what we can see is that let's say 10% is lost, 10% is transferred only, of energy is transferred, and that 90% of the energy is being lost to the surrounding. And let's say the sun provides a number lah, 10,000 kilojoules of energy. So when it's converted, when it's given to the plant, let's say you take the full 10,000 kilojoules, but only 10% is transferred to the rabbit. So that means the rabbit will only get maybe 1,000 kilojoule, and the plant will only get 10,000. In a sense, for this 10,000, maybe 90% of this should be 9,000 kilojoules is escaped to the surrounding as heat or locomotion and what's not. Then of course the next one, the snake will actually get another 10% of these 1,000 kilojoules. So you have 100 kilojoules of energy. The common mistake that students always get is they will always multiply 10% of 10,000 at every stage, which is not true. You have to actually multiply the 10% from the previous trophic level. Okay, and then of course the eagle you'll get 10 kilojoules. Now you can see right what happens here, right, is that for the eagle to obtain that same level of rabbit kind of energy, right, they must eat at least 100 times of the snake, to get the same amount of energy level. So and that's also a reason why we don't see the food chain to be very long, because at every time of a level, right, you only receive 10% of the energy. Then this would not be energetically feasible. Imagine like you have a cheetah and it's at the fifth or sixth animal level, let's say. This means that for every time the cheetah sprint to catch the prey, right, it must consume a lot of this kind of energy, right, that means keep running, right, in order to just kill, maybe to get the rabbit who maybe just eat the grass. The amount of effort is very different. So that's one. Second thing is, if you think about it, every trophic level, right, in terms of predator prey, they tend to be a more scarier predator. So if a lion is already so big, so strong, with sharp fangs and whatnot, the next predator that can kill a lion must be something of more power, maybe like a dinosaur already. And then what can kill a dinosaur? So that's where for us we don't really see food chains, right, to be more than for consumers long or what's not. Okay. So next we look at ecological pyramids. So there are three types of ecological pyramids. You have the pyramid of number, pyramid of biomass, and then pyramid of energy. So the names itself already highlights what are the types of pyramids. So pyramids by number are basically you just have to count the actual number of the organisms. So let's say there is only one tree. Okay. And within one tree, you can have maybe 100 ants. Okay, let's think hundreds, 10,000 ants. Okay. Then you have maybe this same tree can support 100 birds. So we could see that this is just normal counting. Biomass, on the other hand, is the mass, the dry mass of the organism. So if we look at the tree is still very big and heavy, right? So can have a very big kind of biomass. So let's say this is 10,000 kg for the tree. Okay, hypothetically. Then ants, right? Wow, very, very light. So maybe it's not even 1 kg, maybe it's just 1 gram. Okay, I think 1 gram also very hard to believe. 100 grams, maybe. Then, of course, the bird, we got 100 birds, so maybe got a few more kg lah. Let's say 100 kg. So these are all the dry mass. So how to obtain dry mass, right? Is basically, let's say the organism is dead already. You put it into the iron into an oven, and then you switch on the oven to remove all the water vapor in the organism, and then that's the dry mass. Okay, or what we call the biomass. Then of course, payment of energy is basically like what we saw just now, where the sun gives all the energy, let's say 10,000 kilojoules from the for the tree, and based on this, maybe the ants likes to eat the leaf or what's not, right? So they will be able to get 10% of this, so you get 1,000 kilojoules. Then let's say the bird will feed on these ants, and then they will transfer another 10% of energy, so that's another 100 kilojoules. So what I can see is that for the pyramid of energy, it's always an upright position. It's like upright meaning it's always a triangle where the base is always very big and the top is always very small. As compared to the pyramid of numbers and pyramids of biomass, they tend to be very irregular. They are not necessarily always upright in size. Okay, so pyramids of numbers, they just allow you to show the comparison of the number of organisms present in each trophic level at a particular time. And it's constructed based on the number of organisms at each trophic level. Okay. While pyramid of biomass is a comparison of the dry mass of the organisms present in each trophic level at a particular time. So this construction is really just based on the dry mass of the organism in each time. And finally, what we can see is that most ecological pyramids, they are upright, but there are always exceptions. For example, pyramid of numbers, they can be inverted if the organism in one trophic level are parasitic on the organisms of another trophic level. Okay, parasitic means in a sense like you in the relationship, right? The host is the one being harmed. It doesn't benefit the one that is being latched onto. So it's like, let's say you have a leech. The leech will just suck on. I wouldn't say leech lah. Let's say a fern. A fern will leech itself onto a tree. So the fern will always take in all the nutrients from the tree, and therefore providing some form of harm to the tree because I always suck you dry, kind of thing. Okay. And that matter, many small organisms will feed on this, or it can be also in a situation where many small organisms will feed on a large organism, like like a tree with the ant, kind of thing. A pyramid of biomass will be also oddly shaped if the organism in one trophic level would have a higher reproductive rate. That means you're actually able to give birth very fast and produce more. Pyramid of energy, on the other hand, will represent the total energy in each trophic level of the food chain over a period of time. And we can see that at every time over here is that only 10% of energy is being passed on. Okay, so the pyramid of energy is always very broad at the base and narrow at the top, as energy is always lost as we go down the food chain. So this energy loss can be in the form of locomotion, where the movement of the animals or the organism. It can also be loss in the form of heat, yeah, through excretion and respiration. And okay, so these are examples. So this is the one that you have to remember for exam. Usually they will ask you how is the energy loss lah. Okay, so as heat during respiration, uneaten body parts, undigested matter digested by consumers, or even through waste products excreted by your consumers. Next, we look into nutrient cycling in the ecosystem. So we have the carbon cycle. So carbon is constantly removed from and released into the environment in the form of carbon dioxide, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the environment is not lost but continually recycled. So the carbon cycle is very important, and it helps to ensure there's always this continuous supply of carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and it helps to enable energy to flow through the system. One thing to take note is that when we talk about carbon cycle, we are actually cycling the carbon. We are not cycling carbon dioxide. So we are looking at the carbon inside carbon dioxide. Okay, that's how they are being cycled. So how the carbon cycle actually looks like is that, first of all, carbon dioxide is removed from the environment through three main processes. The first one is photosynthesis, where we have the plants would actually absorb carbon dioxide in the environment or in the atmosphere and use it to produce carbon compounds. Okay, so that's the first one. Secondly, we have the feeding system, where feeding meaning the predator-prey relationship or how organisms are eating either each other or the plants, and that when animal feeds on green plant, the carbon compounds will become part of their body. Finally, is through fossil fuel, through the combustion of it for fuel. So carbon compounds may be preserved as fossil fuel, example, coal, natural gas, and oil. Um, sorry, this is true removal, so you can't say combustion. Rather, fossil fuel in the form of like producing that fossil fuel. So through decomposition, through many years, they are being compressed, and then they will just be left to made into fossil fuel deep underground as oil. So we can see that for the carbon cycle, this is where the whole process of photosynthesis, feeding, and even death can take place. But on the other hand, we also see carbon dioxide being released back to the environment because this cycle means that whatever is being taken will also be returned back. So in this case, how are some process in which carbon dioxide is being released? We have your respiration, where carbon compounds such as your glucose are broken down into carbon dioxide gas. Combustion is where the combustion of fossil fuels such as your coal and natural gases will tend to release carbon dioxide gas. Decomposition is when the organisms die and then the dead matter is broken down into simpler substances, for example, like your carbon dioxide decomposes. So these are examples of how the carbon cycle is actually being recycled. Okay. Next, we look at carbon sinks. So this can come in as one additional kind of question in the exam, where how are these carbons being stored, and how the role of ocean and forest acts as carbon sink. So a carbon sink, this came out a few times. The definition of a carbon sink is there is an area that will be able to store carbon compounds for an indefinite period of time, and this stores more carbon than it actually releases the carbon. So ocean as carbon sinks because oceans are the largest carbon sinks in the earth and are on earth, and that the carbon dioxide that dissolves in the ocean's water is usually absorbed and used by phytoplankton and the algae in photosynthesis. A portion of the carbon compounds found in oceans is also buried in the seabed and is in the form of fossil fuel such as your natural gas and oil. So forests are also important carbon sinks, as this atmospheric carbon dioxide is usually absorbed by the plants and used in photosynthesis. A large portion or a large amount of these carbon compounds is also stored in trees, and the remains of these dead trees will form coal, which is a type of fossil fuel. And that's the end for this chapter. Thank you.